Before writing fixed memory into stone and ink, before kings listed their reigns and cities claimed their origins, there was a long stretch of human time that left no clear voice behind. Not because nothing happened, but because what survived was not meant to speak, it was meant to last. Across the world, the earliest monuments, measurements, and alignments appear already complete, already confident, already precise. They do not announce themselves as experiments. They stand as continuations. This documentary explores that quiet inheritance. Not a lost empire with borders and banners, but something more difficult to define. A shared body of knowledge that endured collapse, migration, and forgetting. As you listen, there will be no dramatic claims and no sudden revelations, only patterns, repetition, and the strange consistency of things that should not remember, yet do. Let the silence do the work. The stone before the kingdoms. Long before Egypt recorded its kings in ink and stone, the land beside the Nile already carried monuments that did not easily fit the story told by dynasties. The pyramids at Giza rise from bedrock that was shaped, levelled, and measured with a precision that appears suddenly in the historical record. When the earliest Egyptian texts describe their own past, they do not explain the first appearance of this knowledge. They inherit it as something already present. The commonly accepted dates place the Great Pyramid around 2560 BCE during the reign of Khufu, yet the plateau beneath it shows signs of preparation that suggest a longer and quieter history. Core samples taken from the limestone bedrock reveal levelling marks that extend beyond the pyramid footprints themselves. These cuts are flat to within fractions of a degree across large distances. Such accuracy requires surveying methods that are never described in surviving Old Kingdom texts. The alignment of the pyramids adds to the silence. All three major pyramids at Giza are oriented to true north with a deviation of less than 4 arc minutes. This alignment is more precise than many modern buildings constructed with magnetic instruments. Egyptologists often explain this through stellar observation, usually involving circumpolar stars. Yet the exact method remains debated, and no instructional record survives. The knowledge appears complete, then fades from use. When later Egyptian builders attempted similar alignments, the precision declined. Pyramids built after the 4th dynasty show greater errors. Stone casing becomes rougher. Internal layouts grow simpler. Instead of gradual improvement, the record shows an early peak followed by slow decline. This pattern is unusual for a civilization thought to be discovering these techniques for the first time. Ancient Egyptian texts themselves hint at something older. The Palermo stone, a fragmented basalt slab listing early kings, records rulers who reigned for unusually long spans of time before the dynastic period. Some reigns stretch for hundreds of years. Egyptologists usually interpret these as symbolic or mythological, but the Egyptians did not separate myth from history in the modern sense. To them, the deep past was real, even if distant. The Temple of Edfu preserves inscriptions known as the Edfu building texts. These describe a time when divine beings established sacred structures before floods reshaped the land. The texts speak of a first occasion when plans were laid out according to cosmic measures. The builders are not described as Egyptians, but as beings who existed before kingship was established among humans. Greek historians noticed this gap as well. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, recorded Egyptian priests telling him that their civilization stretched back over 11,000 years. He expressed doubt, yet wrote it down carefully. Manetho, an Egyptian priest writing in the 3rd century BCE, divided Egypt's past into eras that included the rule of gods and semi-divine rulers before human dynasties began. Geology adds another quiet detail. The Great Sphinx shows erosion patterns that resemble water weathering rather than wind and sand. Some geologists have argued that this suggests prolonged exposure to heavy rainfall. In Egypt, such rainfall last occurred at the end of the African humid period before 5000 BCE. If this interpretation is correct, parts of the Giza complex may predate dynastic Egypt by thousands of years. This does not mean Egypt did not build its monuments. It means Egypt may have built upon foundations already present. The pyramids could have been repaired, repurposed, or completed by dynastic rulers who inherited structures older than their own recorded history. This practice was common in Egypt. Temples were rebuilt atop earlier temples. Sacred sites were reused for thousands of years. There are architectural anomalies that support this possibility. The lowest stone blocks of the Great Pyramid weigh up to 80 tons and are fitted together without mortar. Upper layers use smaller stones and less precise joins. The deeper one looks into the structure, the more advanced the masonry becomes. This inversion challenges the idea of a single continuous construction effort. The internal chambers show similar patterns. Granite blocks in the king's chamber are cut with flatness and angles that are difficult to reproduce even with modern machinery. Tool marks do not clearly match copper chisels, which were the primary metal tools of the Old Kingdom. Experiments attempting to replicate these cuts using known Egyptian tools remain incomplete. Ancient maps add another fragment. The Piri Reis map, dated to 1513 CE, depicts coastlines of South America and Antarctica with surprising accuracy. Some scholars suggest it was copied from older source maps. While controversial, the idea that ancient cartographic knowledge once existed at a global scale continues to surface in unexpected places. Myths from other regions echo the same structure. In Mesopotamia, kingship is said to have descended from heaven before the flood. In India, texts describe previous ages that ended in catastrophe. In Mesoamerica, stone builders spoke of earlier worlds destroyed by water and fire. These traditions do not share details, but they share a rhythm. The forgotten global empire, if it existed, would not resemble a modern nation-state. It would be a network of knowledge rather than territory. It would leave behind techniques instead of flags. Its traces would appear as sudden sophistication without local ancestry. The pyramids fit this pattern quietly, without explanation or declaration. Egypt preserved what it inherited. It wrapped ancient stone in ritual, story, and kingship over generations. The origin of the knowledge faded, replaced by reverence. What remained were monuments that continued to stand long after the memory of their first planners was gone. The pyramids do not speak of conquest or war. They speak of measurement, alignment, and endurance. Their silence suggests continuity rather than invention. In this silence, the possibility remains that Egypt was not the beginning of monumental civilization, but its most careful steward, the age without names. Long before writing fixed memory into clay and stone, human time moved without labels. The period before recorded history is often described as empty, yet the land itself suggests long occupation and careful observation. In Egypt, layers beneath known settlements reveal cycles of use, abandonment, and return that stretch far beyond dynastic timelines. These layers do not announce themselves with monuments or texts. They remain quiet, embedded in soil, stone, and climate patterns. During the African humid period, which lasted roughly from 14,800 BCE to around 5,500 BCE, North Africa was not the desert known today. Rain fell regularly. Rivers crossed what are now barren plains. Lakes filled basins that are now dry. Rock art in the Sahara depicts cattle, boats, and dense vegetation. These images were carved by people who lived in stable environments, not transient camps. Archaeological sites, such as Nabta Playa, located deep in the Nubian desert, provide further detail. Between 7,000 and 5,000 BCE, stone circles were constructed there, aligned with solstices and seasonal star risings. These stones were arranged deliberately, requiring planning and shared knowledge. The builders left no written record, but the alignments suggest an understanding of long-term celestial cycles. The presence of astronomy before agriculture challenges common timelines. At Nabta Playa, ritual structures appear before evidence of settled farming. This reverses the usual assumption that complex observation emerges only after surplus food production. Instead, it suggests that tracking time and sky may have been central motivations for early organization. Along the Nile, sediment cores show repeated human interaction with flood patterns. The river shifted course over thousands of years, yet certain high-ground locations were consistently reused. These sites later became dynastic centers. The choice of these locations implies inherited knowledge of landscape behavior, passed down without writing. Stone tools from pre-dynastic Egypt also show anomalies. Some blades and cores demonstrate heat treatment, a technique that improves flint quality and requires controlled temperature. This method appears sporadically, then disappears, then returns later. The pattern does not follow a simple line of improvement. It suggests knowledge gained, lost, and rediscovered. Burial practices offer another fragment. Graves from the Badarian culture, dated to around 4,400 BCE, show careful body positioning, grave goods, and symbolic items. These practices appear already formed, without clear transitional stages. The beliefs behind them are invisible, yet consistent. Climate records show that the end of the African humid period was not gradual. Rainfall declined unevenly. Some regions dried rapidly. Lakes vanished within generations. Human groups were forced to migrate, concentrate, or dissolve. In such conditions, knowledge would fragment. Skills tied to specific environments would become unusable elsewhere. This environmental disruption aligns with flood traditions found across cultures. While often treated as metaphor, floods are a recurring response to climate instability. Rising rivers, collapsing shorelines, and sudden storms would reshape memory as much as land. Oral history would compress these events into single stories. In Egypt, later texts speak of a time when the land was re-established after chaos. Order was restored, boundaries fixed, and measures renewed. These phrases appear religious, but they mirror real processes of resettlement after environmental change. The act of measuring land after floods became sacred because it was essential. The concept of ma'at, central to Egyptian thought, represents balance, order, and correct measure. It is not simply moral, it is spatial and cosmic. This idea may have originated not in palaces, but in survival, knowing when waters would rise, where stars would return, and how land should be divided was the difference between continuity and loss. Stone structures from this nameless age were likely minimal. Wood, reed, and earth leave little trace. What survives are only the most durable markers, often misinterpreted as isolated achievements. When later civilizations encountered these remnants, they absorbed them into new frameworks. The earliest Egyptian temples were not stone. They were rebuilt repeatedly in the same sacred footprints. Over centuries, stone replaced perishable materials, preserving outlines that were already ancient. By the time stone records appear, the origin of the layout was already forgotten. This explains why some Egyptian traditions resist explanation. Measurements are preserved without instructions. Rituals continue without origin stories. Certain sites are revered without historical justification. The authority of age replaces the need for memory. Across the world, similar patterns appear. In South America, early ceremonial centers predate agriculture. In Anatolia, Göbekli Tepe shows monumental construction before settled villages. These sites share one trait. They emerge fully formed, then vanish, leaving successors to wonder. The age without names is not a void. It is a compression of time beyond writing. It contains adaptation, loss, and transmission without authors. When later civilizations arise, they inherit fragments, not blueprints. They build explanations around what remains. If a global network of knowledge existed before recorded civilization, it would leave exactly this kind of trace. Not empires, but alignments. Not laws, but measures. Not texts, but locations, chosen again and again. Egypt, positioned at a crossroads of climate zones, rivers, and skies, would be a natural inheritor of such fragments. Its later stability preserved what other regions lost. The pyramids may be the most visible outcome, but they rest on a much older habit of observation. The age without names ends not with collapse, but with forgetting. Writing narrows memory. What cannot be recorded fades. Yet stone remains where it was placed, waiting to be reused, reinterpreted, and absorbed into new stories. When Egypt began to write its history, it started in the middle of a much longer sequence. What came before was not erased, only unnamed, maps older than memory. Long before maps carried borders, legends, or written place names, people still measured distance and direction with patience. These early maps were not drawn on skin, papyrus, or clay, and they were not meant to be read at a glance. They existed as alignments, repeated angles, proportional distances, and consistent orientations embedded directly into the land itself. This form of mapping did not describe ownership, borders, or political control. It described relationship. Land, water, sky, and time were linked through ratios that appear again and again across distant regions and long spans of time without written explanation or commentary. In this older way of mapping, the landscape was not something to be labelled, but something to be tuned. Hills, plateaus, and plains were chosen for their position within wider patterns. Certain locations were returned to repeatedly, even after centuries of abandonment. These choices suggest an inherited awareness of place, carried forward without records, preserved through repetition rather than instruction. One of the most unusual patterns appears in latitude awareness. The Giza Plateau lies close to the geographic centre of Earth's landmass when calculated using modern measurements. This relationship was not known until satellite data made global calculation possible. Yet Egypt's most significant monuments cluster within this zone. Whether this placement was intentional or inherited, it suggests a sense of balance that extends beyond local geography. It does not appear to serve political or economic needs. Instead, it reflects a concern with position on a larger scale. Angles repeat with quiet consistency across ancient structures. The slope of the Great Pyramid closely matches the angle of latitude at Giza. This relationship connects the curvature of Earth to architectural design in a way that is neither decorative nor symbolic in any obvious sense. It serves no clear religious requirement that survives in text. It functions as a mathematical correspondence, preserved in stone without explanation. No surviving Egyptian inscription explains why this angle mattered, or even acknowledges it as unusual. Across the Atlantic, pyramidal structures in Mesoamerica display recurring slope ratios that echo those found in Egypt. While culturally distinct, these buildings often converge on similar gradients. The convergence is not exact, yet it exceeds what random variation would normally produce. The builders shared no language, metallurgy, or writing systems, but they shared proportion. The reason for this shared geometry remains unrecorded, and it appears without a visible path of transmission. Ancient systems of measurement deepen the puzzle. The Egyptian cubit, the Indus Valley danda, and later Mediterranean units align closely when converted into modern values. These systems are not identical, yet their ratios interlock with notable precision. Standardization across such distance implies transmission of ideas rather than conquest or administration. It does not require centralized authority. It requires continuity of knowledge passed through movement, repetition, and long memory, often without explanation. Cartographic silence becomes most striking, where maps should exist but do not. Egypt possessed writing, mathematics, taxation systems, and land surveys. Boundaries were measured after floods. Fields were reassigned with care, yet no surviving world maps remain. Instead, geographic understanding appears indirectly, encoded in orientation, spacing, and layout. Sacred sites align not only to stars, but to cardinal directions with precision that remains difficult to replicate even with modern tools. The ancient city of Teotihuacan provides another example. Its main axis is oriented slightly east of true north, matching an alignment found at Angkor and in several early Chinese ceremonial centers. This offset corresponds to a specific stellar rising affected by axial precession. Such alignment requires long observation across generations. It cannot be determined within a single lifetime or through casual sky watching. Precession itself moves slowly, completing a cycle over roughly 26,000 years. Awareness of this motion appears in myth rather than numerical tables. Stories of ages turning, worlds renewing, and heavens shifting preserve the idea without calculation. Yet stone structures reflect star positions that no longer match the current sky. These mismatches suggest alignments set to skies of an earlier age, preserved long after their original meaning faded. The Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513, is often cited as an anomaly. It shows coastlines that challenge accepted timelines, including features that resemble ice-free Antarctica. The map's creator stated that older source charts were used. While debated, the map suggests inherited geographic knowledge copied forward without context, preserved long after its original framework was lost. Other early maps echo this pattern. The Orontes Fine map of 1531 depicts a southern continent with rivers and mountain ranges, later confirmed beneath Antarctic ice. No explorer of the time had surveyed these features. The information appears preserved rather than discovered, passed along without explanation, surviving in fragments. Stone circles across Europe function as spatial records rather than decoration. Their placements correlate with solar and lunar cycles, but also with each other. Distances between certain sites repeat specific units, as if measured against a shared reference. These measures do not serve obvious daily needs. The builders left no explanation for why these distances mattered or what they represented. In the Andes, polygonal stone walls resist earthquakes through interlocking angles and irregular joints. Similar techniques appear in Egypt and Japan. These methods do not show gradual experimentation or visible trial and error. They appear complete, then vanish. The knowledge travels without names, without manuals, and without recorded origin. Such techniques suggest that mapping extended beyond geography into materials behavior. Knowing how stone responds to pressure, vibration, and time requires long observation or inherited solutions tested across generations. These solutions survived as practice rather than theory, repeated because they worked, not because they were explained. If a forgotten global culture once existed, its maps would not resemble modern charts. They would not show borders or names. They would encode stable elevations, flood-safe ground, star paths, seasonal cycles, and long-term environmental rhythms. They would be read by builders, surveyors, and ritual planners rather than sailors or merchants. As climates shifted and seas rose after the last ice age, much of this information would disappear. Coastlines changed. Harbours drowned. Low lands vanished beneath water. What remained inland became sacred through survival alone. Later cultures reused these places, building new meanings over older foundations, often without knowing their original purpose. Egypt absorbed such inheritances quietly. Temples rose where land remained stable. Pyramids aligned where sky patterns once mattered. The reason faded, but the placement endured. Over time, the origin of the knowledge dissolved into tradition, ritual, and authority. Maps older than memory do not show continents or empires. They show continuity. Their lines are not inked. They are carved, levelled, and aligned into stone and landscape, waiting not to be rediscovered, but to be recognized. The builders who left no names. Across the ancient world, there are structures that appear without ancestry. They rise suddenly in the archaeological record, fully formed, precise, and difficult to explain, then fade just as quietly. The people who built them left no signatures, no portraits, no written claims of authorship. Their work remains, but their identities do not. This absence is not accidental. It reflects a way of building that did not center the individual, the ruler, or even the culture, but the act itself. In Egypt, the earliest monumental stone construction appears abruptly during the 4th dynasty. The Great Pyramid does not emerge from a long line of trial structures that steadily improve. Instead, it stands at the beginning of a peak. Later, pyramids are smaller, less precise, and more structurally cautious. The decline is gradual, but the mastery at the start is immediate. This pattern suggests inheritance rather than invention. The stones at Giza were shaped and set with tolerances measured in millimeters. Granite blocks weighing tens of tons were placed high within the structure, cut flat enough to meet without mortar. The joints between them are tighter than those in many modern buildings. No construction manuals survive that describe how this was done. No training texts explain the process. The builders remain unnamed. Tool marks add to the uncertainty. Copper tools, which are commonly cited for Old Kingdom construction, struggle to account for the precision seen in granite cutting. Experiments attempting to replicate these cuts using known ancient tools require extensive time, ideal conditions, and still fall short of the results visible in the stone. The methods used by the original builders remain unclear. This anonymity extends beyond Egypt. In the Andes, massive stone walls were assembled using polygonal blocks fitted together without mortar. Each stone is uniquely shaped, interlocking with its neighbours in complex patterns. The walls flex during earthquakes rather than collapsing. The technique appears suddenly, already perfected. Later builders reused the walls, but could not replicate the method at the same scale. In Japan, Ancient stone foundations show similar interlocking techniques, despite no cultural contact with the Andes or Egypt. The stones respond to seismic stress through geometry rather than reinforcement. This approach requires an understanding of material behavior gained through long observation or inherited knowledge. No individual names are associated with these innovations. At Baalbek in modern Lebanon, the foundations of the Roman temple complex include stones weighing over 1,000 tons. These blocks were quarried, transported, and placed with accuracy that remains difficult to explain. Roman texts describe engineering feats elsewhere, yet remain silent on the methods used at Baalbek. The largest stones are older than the Roman structures above them. In Malta, megalithic temples date back to at least 3,600 BCE. They predate Stonehenge and the Egyptian pyramids. Their builders used corbelled stone roofs and precise alignments. No written language existed there at the time. The temples appear fully developed, then the culture that built them disappears, leaving no transition to later forms. This pattern repeats across the globe. Monumental construction emerges suddenly, shows high competence, then declines or vanishes. The builders do not leave personal marks. There are no carved names, no dynastic records tied directly to the earliest phases. The work speaks, but the builders remain silent. In many later cultures, construction becomes an expression of power. Kings inscribe their names. Rulers claim monuments as extensions of their authority. Earlier structures do not follow this pattern. They are anonymous by nature. Their purpose appears collective rather than personal. This anonymity suggests a different relationship to knowledge. Skills were likely transmitted through apprenticeship and repetition rather than documentation. Techniques were guarded by practice, not texts. Once the conditions supporting this transmission ended, the knowledge faded quickly. Environmental change provides one explanation. After the last ice age, rising seas and shifting climates displaced populations. Coastal settlements disappeared. Trade routes changed. Groups carrying specialized knowledge may have been absorbed, scattered, or lost. What remained were the structures built before the disruption. In Egypt, later dynasties treated earlier monuments with reverence. They repaired pyramids, reused temples, and aligned new buildings with older foundations. They did not claim to have invented the techniques. Instead, they framed themselves as restorers of an established order. This attitude appears in religious texts. Egyptian inscriptions often speak of renewing what was set down in the distant past. Order is restored, not created. The act of building becomes an act of maintenance rather than innovation. This framing preserves continuity without explaining origin. The lack of names also complicates archaeology. Without written attribution, structures are assigned to cultures based on proximity or reuse rather than authorship. Later societies often inhabited the remains of earlier ones, blending timelines. The original builders fade behind those who inherited their work. In some cases, the builders may not have seen their work as exceptional. Precision, alignment, and durability may have been expected standards rather than achievements worth recording. In such a worldview, naming oneself would be unnecessary. The builders who left no names did not build for recognition, they built for permanence. Their work was meant to last beyond memory, beyond language, and beyond cultural identity. In this sense, anonymity was a feature, not a flaw. If a forgotten global culture once existed, it would likely produce exactly this pattern. Knowledge would spread through movement rather than conquest. Techniques would be shared without centralized authority. When disruption came, the structures would remain, but the people would not. What survives are stones placed with care, aligned to skies that no longer match, resting on land chosen for reasons now forgotten. The builders are absent, but their methods remain visible, waiting to be studied rather than named. In the silence surrounding these works, the absence of names becomes a clue. It suggests a time when building was not about legacy, but about continuity, knowledge that survived collapse. Civilizations rarely end all at once. They thin, fragment, and disperse. Skills disappear unevenly. Some practices vanish quickly, while others persist long after their original context is gone. When studying the deep past, this uneven survival becomes one of the most important clues. What remains is not a complete record, but a selection shaped by durability, usefulness, and chance. Knowledge that survives collapse is usually practical. It is embedded in routine rather than theory. It lives in habits, layouts, and repeated actions rather than explanations. When writing disappears or populations scatter, this kind of knowledge can continue quietly, passed hand to hand without attribution. In Egypt, many techniques appear already refined at the beginning of recorded history. Stone dressing methods, large-scale surveying, and flood-based land measurement do not develop slowly in visible stages. They appear functional, standardized, and widely understood. This suggests that these skills were not invented during the dynastic period, but inherited from earlier traditions. The Nile itself demanded such inheritance. Annual flooding erased boundary markers and altered fields. Each year, land had to be remeasured and reassigned. This required a stable system of units, angles, and reference points. The consistency of these systems across centuries implies that they were already established before writing fixed them into record. Astronomical knowledge shows similar persistence. Egyptian calendars tracked solar cycles with accuracy that kept seasons aligned for thousands of years. The heliacal rising of Sirius marked the flood reliably. This relationship did not need theoretical explanation to survive. It only needed repetition. As long as it worked, it was preserved. Yet other forms of knowledge faded. Certain construction techniques declined. Later pyramids show reduced precision and simpler internal structures. Stone blocks became smaller. Joints widened. This suggests that some skills were harder to maintain than others. Techniques requiring rare materials, specialized training, or large coordinated labor forces were more vulnerable to disruption. This pattern appears elsewhere. In Mesopotamia, early cities show advanced irrigation and planning that later periods struggle to maintain. In the Indus Valley, standardized bricks and urban layouts vanish after environmental and social change. In Mesoamerica, monumental centers rise and fall, leaving successors who reuse sites but simplify methods. Collapse does not erase memory evenly. Oral traditions compress time. Long sequences become single events. Gradual change becomes catastrophe. Floods, fires, and darkness appear again and again in myth. These stories preserve the fact of disruption without preserving its mechanics. When knowledge survives collapse, it often becomes sacred. What once was practical turns ritual. Measurements become symbolic, alignments become divine. This process protects information by embedding it in belief rather than explanation. Questioning it becomes unnecessary or forbidden. In Egypt, geometry took on religious meaning. The act of measurement was associated with ma'at, the principle of order. Surveying was not just administrative, it was cosmic. This framing ensured continuity, even when the original reasons for specific practices were no longer remembered. The same process can be seen in architecture. Certain proportions recur across temples and monuments. Builders follow rules they do not explain. Deviation is avoided. Innovation becomes less important than correctness. This conservatism preserves inherited forms but limits adaptation. In times of stability, this works well. In times of rapid change, it creates fragility. When environmental conditions shift beyond familiar ranges, inherited practices may fail. Without understanding the underlying principles, societies struggle to adjust. The end of the African humid period is one such shift. Rainfall patterns changed, lakes dried, grasslands turned to desert. Communities that relied on older knowledge systems were forced to migrate or reorganize. Some knowledge adapted, some did not. Those who moved toward the Nile concentrated skills that had once been spread across a wider region. Astronomy, surveying, and stonework may have converged there because conditions allowed continuity. Elsewhere, similar knowledge may have been lost entirely. This selective survival creates the illusion of sudden invention. When writing begins, it captures only what remains at that moment. Everything that was lost before that point becomes invisible. The record starts after the collapse, not before it. Later civilizations often mistake survival for origin. They attribute existing knowledge to their own founders because no earlier authors remain. This is not deception. It is a natural consequence of incomplete memory. Greek thinkers encountered this problem when studying Egypt. They recognized its antiquity but struggled to reconcile it with their own timelines. Egyptian priests spoke of cycles and restorations rather than beginnings. Knowledge was renewed, not created. In Plato's account of Solon's visit to Egypt, priests describe multiple destructions of civilization by water and fire. They explain that Greek history appears short because it has been reset repeatedly. Egypt, protected by geography, preserved more of its past. This story does not specify dates or mechanisms. It preserves the idea of repeated loss. Archaeology increasingly supports this uneven preservation. Coastal sites from the end of the last ice age lie underwater. River valleys were reshaped. Many early settlements are inaccessible or destroyed. What survives inland becomes overrepresented in the record. Stone endures. Alignment endures. Proportion endures. Writing does not, unless carefully preserved. This is why the oldest surviving knowledge often appears abstract or technical. It was embedded in what lasted longest. If a global network of knowledge once existed, it would fragment under stress. Some regions would retain astronomy, others would retain construction, others would retain agriculture. Over time, these fragments would appear unrelated. Egypt's role may have been that of a repository rather than an origin. Its geography buffered it from complete collapse. The Nile provided continuity, deserts provided protection. As a result, certain practices survived there longer than elsewhere. This does not mean Egypt remembered everything. It means Egypt remembered enough to build upon. The pyramids, temples, and calendars represent what endured, not what began. Knowledge that survived collapse did so quietly. It did not announce itself. It waited to be used. When conditions allowed, it resurfaced as structure, alignment, and measurement. What remains today are traces shaped by endurance rather than intention. They point not to a single lost moment, but to repeated survival across disruption. The continuity lies not in culture, but in practice. In this way, the deep past is not empty, it is layered. Each layer preserves what could be carried forward and lets the rest fall away. The monuments stand not because they were meant to explain, but because they were meant to last. The long silence between ages. Between the disappearance of one way of living and the rise of another, there is often a span that leaves little trace. Archaeology refers to these spans as transitional periods, but the term implies motion, improvement, or progression. In many cases, what actually occurs is pause. The long silence between ages is not empty time, it is quiet time, shaped by loss, reduction, and survival. The tools, shelters, and systems that defined earlier life did not endure, and what remains is absence rather than evidence. After major environmental change, human communities rarely rebuild immediately at the same scale or complexity. Population density drops. Networks that once linked distant groups fragment or disappear. Specialized roles dissolve into general survival tasks. Knowledge does not vanish instantly, but it loses structure. Skills once shared across communities become concentrated in fewer hands. When those individuals die or disperse, the skill disappears with them. The end of the last ice age produced such a silence across much of the world. Rising global temperatures melted continental glaciers and raised sea levels by more than 100 meters. Coastlines moved inward, sometimes by dozens of kilometers. River systems shifted, split, or vanished. Entire ecological zones that had supported human life for thousands of years were erased or transformed. Communities that depended on predictable seasons, stable shorelines, and familiar food sources were forced to relocate or adapt rapidly. Much of early human settlement followed water. Coasts, deltas, and estuaries offered food, transportation, and access to trade. These areas encouraged repeated occupation and the accumulation of knowledge over long periods. When sea levels rose, these same advantages became liabilities. Camps, villages, and early ceremonial sites were submerged. What disappeared was not only land, but memory anchored to place. The silence left behind is physical rather than cultural. The record is missing because the ground itself is missing. Inland regions experienced a different outcome. Plateaus, riverbanks, and elevated plains remained accessible as coastlines drowned. Groups that moved toward these areas carried fragments of older knowledge with them. They brought habits of observation, seasonal awareness, and basic measurement. What they did not bring were the full systems that once supported those habits, including trade networks, shared labor pools, and long-established institutions. This fragmentation creates a recognizable archaeological pattern. When new cultures appear in the record after periods of disruption, they often show uneven sophistication. Astronomy may be advanced, while metallurgy remains simple. Architecture may be precise, while agriculture appears limited. These mismatches do not follow a smooth developmental curve. They suggest inheritance of partial knowledge rather than local invention from the beginning. In Egypt, this unevenness is especially clear. Early dynastic society displays complex religious symbolism, precise geometry, calendrical order, and administrative structure alongside relatively simple domestic tools and technologies. The sophistication does not spread evenly across daily life. Instead, it clusters around activities that had survived disruption most effectively, such as surveying, astronomy, and monument placement. The silence between ages also reshapes memory itself. Oral tradition compresses long spans into brief narratives. Gradual processes become singular events. Multiple generations collapse into a small number of named ancestors. The longer the silence, the simpler and more symbolic the story that emerges on the other side. Flood myths illustrate this compression clearly. They appear across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, sharing a common structure but differing in detail. A great inundation resets the world. Survivors preserve fragments of knowledge. Order is restored. These stories do not preserve dates, locations, or mechanisms. They preserve sequence and consequence. Written history begins only after this silence has already passed. By the time writing appears, societies are not at their beginning. They are already standing on inherited ground. What writing captures is continuity rather than origin. The silence before writing becomes invisible, not because it did not exist, but because it could not be recorded. This creates a distortion in how history is interpreted. The first written records appear to describe beginnings, but they often describe restarts. What came before is treated as myth or dismissed entirely, not because it was imaginary, but because it was undocumented. Writing narrows the visible past. Material culture reflects this gap. Tools and structures sometimes appear abruptly in the archaeological record, without clear local precursors. Later scholars search for developmental stages that may never have existed in the same region. Those stages occurred elsewhere, earlier, and were lost to flooding, erosion, or abandonment. Stone is one of the few materials that consistently bridges the silence. It survives fire, water, and time better than wood, fibre, or earth. When stone structures remain, they anchor later activity. New cultures build beside them, reuse them, or imitate them, often without understanding their original context or purpose. This reuse blurs authorship. Structures built by one group become associated with another. Over generations, the distinction fades. The silence absorbs the difference, and the monument becomes timeless rather than historical. The long silence between ages is not a single moment or collapse. It is a series of pauses, migrations, contractions, and partial recoveries. Each pause reshapes what knowledge remains available. Over thousands of years, this process produces the layered past visible today, where different levels of skill, belief, and memory overlap without clear boundaries. Understanding this silence changes how ancient monuments are interpreted. Instead of asking who invented a particular technique, it becomes more useful to ask why it survived in one place and not another. Survival depends less on innovation than on geography, climate, stability, and social continuity. Egypt's position favoured survival in ways few other regions experienced. The Nile provided predictable renewal even during broader instability. Annual floods restored fertility without destroying the entire landscape. Surrounding deserts limited invasion, migration pressure, and rapid cultural turnover. This created a refuge where fragments of older knowledge could persist longer than in more volatile regions. The silence did not end when dynasties began. It continued beneath writing, shaping what was remembered and what was forgotten. Even as texts accumulated, they referred back to an earlier time already lost, described in vague terms as a distant age of order or chaos. What survives from the deep past is not a complete narrative, but a pattern. Precision without explanation, alignment without record, continuity without memory. These are the marks left by the long silence between ages. The past did not disappear. It became quiet when the seas rose. At the end of the last ice age, change did not arrive suddenly. It advanced quietly, year by year, in ways that were difficult to notice within a single lifetime. Glaciers that had covered vast portions of the northern continents began to melt. The meltwater flowed slowly into the oceans. Shorelines retreated, not in dramatic waves, but in steady increments that altered familiar paths and erased known landmarks. Between roughly 12,000 and 6,000 years ago, global sea levels rose by more than 100 meters. This rise did not occur evenly. Some centuries saw rapid increases, others slowed. For communities living near the coast, the effect was cumulative. Fishing grounds changed depth, estuaries shifted inland, camps that once stood safely above high tide found water creeping closer each generation. Early human settlement favoured coastlines. These regions provided reliable food sources, diverse ecosystems, and easy travel by water. Long before agriculture became widespread, coastal environments supported dense populations. Knowledge accumulated there over many generations. Routes, seasons, and safe harbours were learned and remembered. When the seas rose, this accumulated knowledge lost its physical reference. As shorelines moved, people adapted at first. Camps were relocated slightly inland. Seasonal routes were adjusted. But over centuries, entire landscapes vanished. Continental shelves that had once been dry land were submerged. What had been valleys, plains, and river mouths became sea floor. Evidence of habitation followed them underwater. This loss creates a distortion in the archaeological record. Early coastal cultures appear sparse or absent, not because they were rare, but because their remains now lie beyond easy reach. Stone tools, hearths, and dwellings were buried beneath sediment. What survives inland becomes overrepresented, shaping modern assumptions about early human life. The rising seas also fractured networks. Coastal routes that once linked distant groups were interrupted. Islands formed where land bridges had existed. Populations became isolated. Shared practices diverged. Knowledge that depended on regular contact began to fragment. In some regions, the retreat from the sea was orderly. Communities followed rivers inland, maintaining continuity. In others, geography offered no gradual path. Steep coasts or narrow plains forced sudden relocation. In these cases, memory of place was severed more abruptly. The effect on knowledge transmission was uneven. Practical skills tied to daily survival could adapt quickly. Techniques tied to specific landscapes could not. Navigation based on now submerged landmarks lost meaning. Seasonal indicators tied to coastal ecology became unreliable. As groups moved inland, they encountered new environments. Rivers replaced tides as primary rhythms. Flood cycles replaced coastal seasons. Knowledge had to be reinterpreted. What survived was not exact information, but methods of observation. In regions like the Nile Valley, this transition proved favourable. The river offered predictable flooding, fertile soil, and clear cycles. Groups arriving from different directions brought fragments of older knowledge. Over time, these fragments combined, reinforced by stability. Elsewhere, rising seas erased more than land. They erased continuity. In areas where inland environments were harsh or fragmented, populations dispersed further. Skills that required coordination or long training disappeared. Only what could be relearned easily remained. This uneven survival explains why certain forms of knowledge appear suddenly in the historical record. They did not arise quickly. They resurfaced where conditions allowed them to be practiced again. Writing captures this moment as a beginning, even though it is a return. Flood traditions reflect this experience. Stories of land lost to water appear across cultures. These stories do not preserve geography, they preserve consequence. The world changes. People move. Knowledge must be rebuilt. These accounts often describe survivors carrying essential skills forward. Crafts, laws, or measures are preserved by a few. The world that emerges afterward resembles the old one, but not entirely. Something is missing. Something is simplified. As seas stabilized around 6,000 years ago, new coastlines became fixed, human settlement patterns adjusted, trade routes reformed, inland centres grew in importance. The memory of drowned lands faded within generations, surviving only as stories. The stabilization allowed long-term projects again. Architecture became more permanent. Astronomy regained importance as cycles could be tracked consistently. Measurement systems became standardized. These developments appear rapid because the long period of adaptation preceded them silently. In Egypt, the effects of sea level rise were indirect but significant. As the Sahara dried and coastlines shifted, populations concentrated along the Nile. This concentration preserved and intensified knowledge. What had once been dispersed became centralized. The Nile's predictable behavior contrasted with the instability experienced elsewhere. Floods occurred annually, not catastrophically. This reliability allowed planning beyond immediate survival. Over time, practices rooted in observation became formalized. Yet, even in Egypt, memory of earlier landscapes faded. Texts speak of a primeval flood, of chaos before order. These references are abstract. They acknowledge disruption without detail. The sea itself is rarely named as the cause. This silence is not ignorance. It reflects distance. By the time writing appeared, the sea had already risen and stabilized. The people who experienced the change directly were long gone. Their descendants inherited a transformed world and partial explanations. Underwater archaeology now reveals glimpses of what was lost. Submerged structures, tools, and landscapes appear along ancient coastlines. These discoveries suggest that early human activity was far more extensive than previously assumed. However, the submerged past remains difficult to study. Water obscures context, sediment covers detail. What is found raises questions, but rarely provides full answers. The silence remains. Though slightly disturbed, the rising seas did not erase civilization. They reshaped it. They selected what could endure and what would vanish. They determined which regions would carry fragments of the past forward and which would forget entirely. When later civilizations looked backward, they saw only what remained above water. Inland monuments appeared ancient and singular. Coastal origins disappeared from view. The story of civilization shifted inland. Understanding this process reframes early history. The absence of evidence becomes evidence of absence only if context is ignored. When seas rise, they remove chapters, not entire books. The world after the seas rose was quieter, more fragmented, and more selective. From this quieter world, the civilizations we recognize emerged. They did not begin from nothing. They assembled themselves from what the water spared. What remains today is a shoreline memory without shorelines. The sea has kept its record. It waits below, while history is written above. In this way, the rise of the seas did not end an age. It hid it. Memory without writing. Before marks were pressed into clay or inked onto stone, memory carried the weight of continuity. Knowledge moved through voice, gesture, rhythm, and repetition. It lived in shared practices rather than fixed records. In such a world, memory was not a storehouse of dates and names. It was a process, renewed each time it was performed. Oral societies did not preserve information by listing facts. They preserved it by embedding knowledge into actions that had to be repeated to remain useful. Seasonal movements, building practices, and ceremonial routines functioned as living records. When these actions continued, memory survived. When they stopped, memory dissolved quickly. This form of memory was resilient in stable environments. As long as landscapes remained familiar and cycles predictable, Knowledge could pass across generations with little loss. Children learned by watching and doing. Elders corrected mistakes through example. No explanation was required beyond practice itself. Environmental disruption changed this balance. When floods reshaped land or drought altered seasons, practices lost their reference points. A ritual tied to a vanished riverbank no longer made sense. A story explaining a former shoreline lost clarity. Without the physical world to reinforce it, memory weakened. As communities migrated, memory traveled unevenly. Some knowledge could be adapted to new conditions, other knowledge could not. Skills tied to materials unavailable in new environments faded first. Skills tied to observation and measurement survived longer. This selective survival reshaped tradition. What endured became central, what failed became peripheral or symbolic. Over time, memory shifted from practical instruction to mythic outline. Actions once grounded in necessity became ritualized echoes. In Egypt, this process can be seen in early religious practice. Many rituals appear formalized without explanation. Measurements are repeated precisely, yet their origins are not described. The act itself carries authority. Questioning why becomes unnecessary. The concept of sacred tradition emerges from this process. When the reason for a practice is forgotten, but the outcome remains effective, continuity is preserved by reverence. To change the practice risks breaking something unseen. Memory is protected by ritual rather than understanding. This transition occurs naturally in oral cultures, facing long-term change. Explanation gives way to preservation. What works is kept, what does not is abandoned. Over generations, the line between knowledge and belief blurs. Myth becomes a vessel for compressed memory. It does not record detail. It records sequence and consequence. Events are simplified. Characters merge. Long processes become singular acts. This is not distortion, it is adaptation. Flood stories are one example. They appear in cultures separated by oceans, each shaped by local geography. The details differ, but the structure remains. A world is disrupted. Survivors carry forward what matters. Order returns in altered form. The story preserves the experience of loss without preserving its mechanics. Without writing, memory depends on repetition. Anything not repeated disappears. This creates a bias towards cyclical knowledge. Calendars, seasonal markers, and ritual dates survive well. Linear history does not. When writing appears, it captures only what remains at that moment. Everything already lost remains invisible. Writing freezes memory, but also narrows it. The first written records often mistake survival for origin. In Egypt, early texts refer to a distant past already framed as ancient. Gods establish order. Kings restore balance. What came before is acknowledged but not described. The silence remains. This silence is not absence of awareness, it is absence of detail. The memory exists as a boundary rather than a narrative. Beyond a certain point, the past is known only as different. Writing does not recover this lost memory, it replaces it. What can be written becomes history, what cannot becomes myth. Over time, the distinction hardens, even though both emerged from the same source. Material culture reinforces this shift. Stone monuments preserve form without explanation. Later generations replicate proportions without knowing why they matter. Precision survives without context. This pattern appears globally. At sites where writing arrived late, complex structures already existed. Writing records their use, not their creation. The builders remain unnamed. The techniques remain unexplained. Memory without writing also explains why certain knowledge appears timeless. Astronomical alignments persist across centuries because they must be correct to function. Their accuracy enforces their repetition. Error would reveal itself immediately. Other forms of knowledge degrade more quickly. Tool-making techniques change. Decorative styles shift. Only what resists failure remains stable. This selective memory produces the illusion of sudden advancement. When conditions allow complex practices to reappear, they seem new. In reality, they are old methods returning to visibility. Egypt's stability allowed this return to occur earlier and more clearly than in many regions. The Nile anchored memory. Repetition reinforced tradition. Writing captured what survived. Yet even here, memory remained incomplete. Texts reference earlier times, but do not explain them. The origin of practices is deferred to divine or primordial ages. This deferral protects tradition without explaining it. Memory without writing leaves traces rather than records. These traces require interpretation rather than translation. They speak through alignment, proportion, and placement rather than words. The long continuity of certain practices suggests they were valued because they worked, not because they were understood. Knowledge survived collapse by becoming habit. What remains today is not a lost library, but a pattern of endurance. The past is present through what could not be forgotten, even when it could no longer be explained. Memory did not vanish before writing. It changed form, the inheritance of stone. Stone does not forget, unlike wood, fibre, or earth. It survives long after the hands that shaped it are gone. When societies fracture or migrate, stone remains where it was placed, fixed within the landscape. Because of this endurance, stone becomes the primary medium through which deep time communicates with later ages. What survives is not intention or explanation, but form, position, and relationship. As human groups resettled after periods of disruption, they encountered stone structures already present. These structures were not ruins in the modern sense. They were intact, functional, and often aligned to natural features that still mattered. Rivers still flooded, stars still rose, shadows still fell in predictable ways. Even without knowing who built these structures or why, later societies recognized their usefulness. This recognition did not require understanding. It required continuity of place. A stone platform that remained dry during floods became valuable. A wall that resisted earthquakes became trustworthy. A structure aligned with the sun continued to mark seasons correctly. Use preceded explanation. In Egypt, the reuse of stone began early. Temples were constructed atop older foundations. Sacred precincts were rebuilt repeatedly, layer upon layer, following the same orientation. Even when materials changed, the footprint remained constant. This repetition suggests that the location itself held authority beyond the structure placed upon it. The pyramids fit this pattern. Later dynasties did not attempt to replicate the Great Pyramid at the same scale or precision. Instead, they repaired it, studied it, and integrated it into religious tradition. The monument became a reference point rather than a model. Its presence defined limits rather than inviting imitation. This process transforms stone into inheritance. The structure becomes part of cultural identity regardless of origin. Over generations, the question of who built it fades. What matters is that it stands, that it works, and that it has always been there. Across the Mediterranean, similar patterns appear. In Greece, Mycenaean walls were reused by later populations who no longer possessed the tools or techniques to build them. The walls were attributed to giants or mythical figures. The explanation shifted from practical to symbolic, but the use continued. In the Andes, Inca builders incorporated far older polygonal stone walls into their own cities. They built upon them, not because they fully understood how they were made, but because they trusted their stability. The older stones became foundations for new authority. This reuse blurs timelines. Archaeology often assigns structures to the most recent culture that used them, not the one that created them. Over time, origin and inheritance merge. Stone absorbs the identities placed upon it. The durability of stone also creates a selective memory. Practices tied to stone endure longer than those tied to perishable materials. Measurement systems embedded in architecture survive even when written explanations vanish. Proportions repeat because altering them risks failure. In Egypt, certain architectural ratios recur across centuries. Builders follow established relationships between height, base, and angle without deviation. These ratios are preserved through repetition, not theory. They are inherited rules. The same inheritance appears in surveying. Later Egyptian texts describe land measurement rituals that are already formalized. The language suggests restoration rather than innovation. Fields are measured according to ancient standards. Boundaries are renewed, not invented. Stone reinforces this conservatism. Once a structure proves reliable, altering it becomes risky. Knowledge embedded in stone resists change. This resistance preserves fragments of earlier understanding even when context is lost. In times of stability, inheritance through stone creates continuity. In times of change, it creates rigidity. When environmental conditions shift beyond familiar limits, inherited forms may no longer function as intended, yet they persist because authority is tied to age rather than adaptability. This tension appears in later Egyptian history. Temples continue to follow ancient layouts even as political and environmental conditions change. The form endures longer than its practical justification. Elsewhere, inheritance through stone produces different outcomes. In regions prone to earthquakes or flooding, older structures are valued specifically because they survive stress. Builders reuse them selectively, prioritizing function over symbolism. In all cases, stone serves as a carrier of knowledge stripped of explanation. It tells later societies what worked, but not why. Interpretation fills the gap. Myth replaces method. This process explains why ancient builders are often described as gods, giants, or lost races. When techniques cannot be replicated and origins are unknown, supernatural explanations emerge. These explanations preserve respect without requiring understanding. Stone also shapes memory by fixing place. Sacred geography persists even when belief systems change. A hill, platform, or enclosure remains important because it always has been. New meanings accumulate around old forms. In Egypt, this layering of meaning is visible in temple inscriptions that reference earlier restorations. Kings present themselves as caretakers of ancient order. Their authority derives from continuity, not originality. The inheritance of stone also influences how history is written. Written records focus on events, rulers, and conflicts. Stone records focus on stability. What survives longest shapes interpretation. When later scholars encounter ancient monuments, they often assume deliberate design according to the culture that left the most writing. This assumption overlooks inheritance. Stone outlives text. The absence of explanation does not imply absence of origin. Under this lens, the pyramids appear less as isolated achievements and more as preserved artifacts of continuity. They represent knowledge that survived collapse by being embedded in durable form. The same can be said for stone circles, megalithic walls, and ancient platforms worldwide. Their builders remain unknown not because they were insignificant, but because their medium outlasted their memory. Inheritance through stone is not passive. It actively shapes later behavior. Builders align new structures to old ones. Surveyors reference ancient points. Rituals adapt to inherited space. This continuity creates the illusion of timeless tradition. In reality, it is a chain of reuse. Each generation adds interpretation while preserving form. Stone does not explain itself. It does not defend its origin. It simply remains. This remaining is enough to influence thousands of years of human activity. The deep past survives not as story, but as structure. What was built to endure became the vessel through which knowledge crossed silence. In this way, stone does not transmit civilization. It transmits possibility. Later societies step into forms already shaped and decide what they mean. What stands today is not the voice of the first builders, but the echo of what endured when everything else fell away. The inheritance of stone is the inheritance of survival itself. What the sky remembered. Long before calendars were written or numbers were fixed into tables, the sky offered a record that did not erode. Stars rose and set in reliable patterns. The sun marked days and seasons with slow consistency. The moon repeated its phases without instruction. For early societies emerging from disruption, the sky became the most stable reference available. Land could flood or dry, coastlines could vanish, stone could crack, the sky remained. This stability made the sky a natural keeper of memory. Knowledge tied to celestial cycles survived collapse more easily than knowledge tied to landscape. Even when people moved, the same stars followed them. The same sun governed growth and decay. Observation required no tools beyond patience and repetition. In many early cultures, astronomy did not exist as a separate discipline. It was inseparable from survival. Seasonal movement, planting, harvesting, and ritual depended on knowing when change would come. This knowledge was reinforced daily. Errors revealed themselves quickly. Accuracy mattered. Because of this, sky knowledge survived where other systems failed. It did not require permanent structures or centralized authority. It required continuity of observation. A single generation could pass it forward intact if conditions allowed. In Egypt, this inheritance is visible in the calendar. The heliacal rising of Sirius marked the arrival of the Nile flood with remarkable reliability. This relationship did not need explanation to endure. As long as the star appeared and the flood followed, the association remained valid. Over centuries, this observation became formalized. What began as practical awareness turned into ritual. The star became sacred. The flood became symbolic. Yet beneath the symbolism, the original function remained unchanged. Architectural alignment reflects the same process. Temples and monuments were oriented towards solstices, equinoxes, and specific star risings. These alignments required precision, but not theory. Builders needed only to repeat what worked. When conditions changed slowly, alignments drifted out of accuracy. Precession altered star positions over long spans. Some monuments no longer matched the sky as originally intended. Yet the structures remained aligned to a remembered sky, not the current one. This mismatch reveals inheritance. Alignments were preserved beyond their functional lifespan. Their authority came from age, not accuracy. Later builders copied orientation without questioning its origin. This pattern appears globally. Stone circles, pyramids, and platforms often align to celestial events that no longer occur as they once did. The sky moved, but memory did not adjust. In oral cultures, the sky also served as narrative. Constellations carried stories that encoded timing, direction, and moral order. These stories changed slowly because they were reinforced by repeated observation. Unlike written records, sky stories could survive fragmentation. Even when communities split, the same stars remained overhead. Variations emerged, but core structures persisted. This resilience explains why astronomical knowledge often appears advanced relative to other technologies in early societies. It was easier to preserve, it required fewer resources, it punished error immediately. As writing developed, sky knowledge was among the first to be recorded. Calendars, star lists, and ritual dates appear early in written history. They were already mature systems by the time they were written down. This creates another illusion of sudden invention. Writing captures astronomy at a high level of refinement, obscuring the long period of observation that preceded it. In Egypt, texts describe the sky as ordered before kings ruled the land. This framing acknowledges inheritance without explanation. The sky becomes a source of authority beyond human memory. The stars also provided orientation when landscapes failed. Travelers could navigate without landmarks. Builders could establish cardinal directions without maps. The sky offered a universal frame. During periods of migration caused by climate change or rising seas, this frame became essential. Groups moving inland or across unfamiliar terrain relied on celestial reference rather than local knowledge. Over time, this reliance deepened. Sky observation became embedded in ritual and architecture, ensuring its continuation even when its practical necessity diminished. When later civilizations encountered ancient monuments aligned to the sky, they inherited both the structure and its orientation, even if the alignment no longer served its original purpose. Altering it risked breaking continuity. This conservatism preserved astronomical patterns long after their context was lost. The sky remembered what the land forgot. In this way, celestial knowledge acted as a bridge across silence. It carried fragments of deep time into recorded history without explanation. It survived because it worked, and later because it was sacred. What remains today are structures pointing towards stars that no longer rise where they once did. These misalignments are not errors, they are records of a remembered sky. The sky did not store names, dates, or stories as humans understand them. It stored rhythm. That rhythm guided survival long after other memories faded. When civilizations rebuilt after collapse, they looked upward for stability. The sky offered continuity when the world below had changed. What the sky remembered was not history, but order, and that order endured. The first kings of restoration. When writing finally entered the historical record, it did not announce beginnings. Instead, it described repair. The earliest rulers did not present themselves as creators of a new world, but as caretakers of one already damaged, inherited, and incomplete. Authority was framed not through innovation, but through restoration. Kingship emerged as a response to loss rather than triumph. In early Egypt, the role of the king was defined less by conquest than by balance. Inscriptions do not speak of founding order from nothing. They speak of re-establishing ma'at, the principle of harmony that already existed but had been disrupted. This framing implies a remembered state of order older than any dynasty. The king was not portrayed as an inventor of law or structure. He was depicted as the one who corrected imbalance, measured land anew, repaired temples, and renewed rights. These acts were restorative by nature. They assume a prior condition that had fallen out of alignment. This language appears consistently in early royal texts. Kings renew what was ruined, set right what had fallen, and restore the first time. The phrase "the first time" does not refer to a historical date. It refers to a remembered condition beyond reach, an ideal past that serves as reference rather than record. Such phrasing is not symbolic flourish. It reflects social reality. The societies emerging after environmental disruption inherited fragments of systems they did not fully understand. Restoration was safer than experimentation. Authority came from aligning with what was believed to be ancient and correct. This model of kingship appears elsewhere as well. In Mesopotamia, early rulers claimed to rebuild temples according to ancient plans received from the gods. Inscriptions emphasize faithful reconstruction rather than original design. Kings boast of restoring foundations laid in remote ages. These rulers did not claim authorship of knowledge, they claimed access to it. Their legitimacy depended on their ability to align present action with inherited order. Innovation risked disorder. Continuity ensured stability. The first kings governed societies that remembered loss. Even when the details had faded, the sense of prior collapse remained. Floods, migrations, and environmental shifts had shaped collective memory. Kingship emerged as a stabilizing role within that memory. This explains why early law codes and administrative systems appear formalized from the outset. Measurement systems are fixed, ritual calendars are established. These structures did not develop slowly in writing. They were already in use before they were recorded. Writing served to preserve what had survived, not to invent anew. Once written, these systems appeared permanent. Their origin was no longer questioned. The act of recording transformed inherited practice into authoritative tradition. In Egypt, kingship was tied to land measurement. After the Nile flood, fields had to be reassigned. The king's authority ensured that this process followed ancient rules. Surveying became a sacred act. Geometry was embedded in ritual. This connection between rulership and measurement reinforces the idea of restoration. The land did not belong to the king. It belonged to order. The king's task was to reinscribe that order after disruption. The same principle applied to temples. Many early temples were built atop older foundations. Inscriptions emphasize renewal rather than construction. Kings describe clearing rubble, resetting stones, and re-establishing sacred boundaries. These actions imply that something stood there before. Even when earlier structures were no longer visible, their memory shaped placement and orientation. Restoration preserved alignment even when material continuity was broken. The image of the king as restorer also shaped myth. Divine kingship was justified through lineage, extending into the distant past. Gods ruled before humans. Semi-divine beings governed between ages. Human kings inherited a diminished version of this authority. This mythic structure mirrors archaeological reality. Authority descends through loss. Each age holds less than the one before. Kings rule not over abundance, but over remnants. This framing discouraged radical change. The goal was not progress, but maintenance. Deviating from tradition risked breaking fragile continuity. As a result, early states favored repetition over experimentation. This conservatism preserved fragments of deep knowledge. Astronomical calendars remained accurate. Monumental alignments persisted. measurement systems stayed consistent. These survivals depended on restoration rather than reinvention. However, restoration also concealed origin. By attributing ancient practices to divine or primordial times, societies avoided confronting the silence between ages. The past became sacred rather than historical. This pattern appears in king lists. Early reigns stretch impossibly long. Some kings rule for hundreds or thousands of years. These figures are often dismissed as myth, but they reflect compressed memory rather than fiction. Long spans of time without writing collapse into symbolic durations. Extended reigns stand in for lost ages. The king list becomes a bridge across silence, not a literal chronology. The first kings of restoration ruled societies already shaped by inheritance. Their authority rested on alignment with what remained rather than creation of something new. They governed not beginnings, but continuations. This explains why the earliest monumental states appear mature. Their institutions are stable, their symbolism is complex, their cosmology is already integrated. These features suggest long prehistory rather than sudden emergence. The role of the king was to embody continuity. Even as dynasties changed, the office remained the same. The king was the living link between past and present, restoring order each generation. Over time, this restorative role hardened into tradition. Later kings still claimed to restore what was ancient, even as centuries passed. The reference point remained fixed, though increasingly distant. This distance created reverence. The older the tradition, the stronger its authority. Eventually, origin no longer mattered. Survival itself conferred legitimacy. The first kings did not rule over beginnings, they ruled over aftermaths. Their power came from stabilizing a world shaped by loss and silence. Understanding this reframes early civilization. States did not rise from simplicity to complexity in a straight line. They reassembled complexity from fragments that endured. Kingship was not the birth of order, it was its repair. What survives in text and stone is not the story of creation, but the story of maintenance. Civilization did not begin with kings. Kings emerged when something older needed to be kept from falling apart again. In this way, the earliest rulers were not founders of civilization, but custodians of memory, standing at the edge of a past already out of reach. They ruled the present on behalf of what was no longer fully remembered, the civilization before civilization. The question does not begin with monuments. It begins with pattern. Across continents, across climates, across cultures that never met in recorded time, the same fragments appear. Precision without instruction, alignment without explanation, measurement without origin. These fragments do not form a complete picture, but they recur too often to be dismissed as coincidence. They suggest inheritance rather than invention. A civilization before civilization would not resemble later states. It would leave no dynastic records, no carved names, no written laws. Writing is fragile, it appears late and disappears easily. What would survive instead are practices embedded in durable systems: stone, sky, proportion, place. The evidence does not point to a single empire or capital, it points to a network of shared knowledge. Techniques appear where conditions allowed them to endure. They vanish where disruption was too severe. What remains is uneven, scattered, and incomplete, exactly what would be expected after repeated environmental collapse. This civilization, if it existed, would not be remembered as history. It would be remembered as tradition, myth, and habit. Knowledge would pass through action rather than explanation. When those actions stopped, memory would compress. What survived would feel timeless. The deep past was shaped by instability. The end of the last ice age altered coastlines, climates, and ecosystems worldwide. Human populations moved, split, and regrouped. In such conditions, centralized authority is unlikely to persist. What persists instead is technique that can travel. Surveying methods, astronomical observation, and stone construction fit this requirement. They are portable in concept even when tools change. They rely on repetition rather than infrastructure. They can survive in fragments. The archaeological record shows that when complex practices reappear after periods of silence, they do so already refined. Early monumental construction does not begin clumsily. It begins confidently. This is visible in Egypt, in Anatolia, in the Andes, and in parts of South Asia. Each region displays sudden competence, followed by gradual simplification. This pattern contradicts linear development. It aligns with selective survival. Knowledge that can be maintained through disruption returns. Knowledge that cannot disappears. The absence of written instruction is often used to argue against deep antiquity. Yet this absence is expected. Writing emerges after stability, not before it. Anything that predates writing must survive without it, or not at all. The sky provided continuity when land did not. Astronomical cycles offered reliable reference across migration. Alignments preserved celestial memory in stone long after their original context faded. When precession altered the sky, alignments remained fixed, recording a remembered world. Stone preserved form when explanation vanished. Structures that resisted flood, quake, or time became anchors. Later societies reused them, not knowing their origin but trusting their endurance. Over generations, origin ceased to matter. The reuse of ancient stone blurs authorship. Structures become associated with those who last touched them, not those who first built them. This reassignment is not deliberate, it is inevitable. In this way, a civilization before civilization would be everywhere and nowhere. Its traces would appear under later cultures, absorbed into them, mislabeled as beginnings. This also explains why early states describe themselves as restorers. Kings do not claim to invent order, they claim to renew it. The language of restoration appears too consistently to be metaphor alone. It reflects inheritance without memory. Myth bridges this gap. Gods rule before humans. Semi-divine kings reign for impossible lengths of time. These narratives do not preserve chronology. They preserve the sense that something older existed and was lost. Flood stories, age cycles, and golden eras appear worldwide. They are not proof of a single event, they are evidence of shared experience. Disruption followed by rebuilding. A civilization before civilization would not need to be global in territory. It would be global in influence. Its knowledge would spread through movement rather than conquest. It would leave shared techniques rather than shared language. This influence would be strongest where geography favored survival. River valleys, stable plateaus, and sheltered regions would retain fragments longer. Egypt fits this profile. So do parts of the Andes and Anatolia. The fact that these regions later appear as cradles of civilization may be less about origin and more about preservation. They did not begin first, they remembered longer. Modern archaeology struggles with this idea because it challenges categorization. Disciplines rely on clear starts and clear ownership. A fragmented inheritance resists both. Yet the data increasingly supports complexity earlier than expected. Submerged coastlines reveal ancient habitation. Pre-agricultural monumental sites challenge timelines. Advanced astronomical knowledge appears before writing. None of these alone prove a lost civilization. Together, they suggest a missing chapter. This chapter is not a vanished empire with borders and kings. It is a phase of human organization adapted to a world very different from ours, a world of shifting coastlines, changing skies, and unstable climates. In such a world, survival favors observation, coordination, and restraint. Monumentality would be rare and purposeful. Knowledge would be practical and sacred at once. When that world ended, what followed was not collapse into ignorance, but fragmentation. Pieces survived. They were carried forward by people who no longer remembered their origin. Civilization, as we recognize it, assembled itself from those pieces. Writing froze memory. States claimed authorship. The silence before them hardened into myth. The question is not whether there was a civilization before civilization. The question is how much continuity we are willing to acknowledge when evidence survives without explanation. History prefers stories with beginnings. The deep past offers patterns instead. Patterns do not argue, they repeat. What stands in stone, alignment, and measure is not proof of a forgotten name. It is proof of endurance across loss. The civilization before civilization did not vanish. It thinned, it scattered, it became quiet, and in that quiet, it shaped everything that followed. If this quiet way of exploring the past resonates with you, consider subscribing to the channel. New long-form documentaries are released regularly, each designed for calm listening, reflection, and sleep. If you found this chapter meaningful, gently tap like so others can find it too. You can also leave a comment with the questions that stayed with you after listening. Thank you for spending this time in the deep past.